Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson, and welcome to our construction site management course. And today's lesson, we're going to be looking at changes and claims in the construction industry. And it's really a big topic. It's split up into two lectures, 11A and 11B. 11B, I'm going to get into sort of some of the impacts that it has on your overall financial statements, and also how you can track changes in a schedule and some of the things that you need to think about from that. But 11A, we're going to be looking at the reality of changes, how they occur, some of the different types, the process involved, a sample change order form, so that you get a good idea of the process and what's required. So when we think about the reality of changes, most word in the industry is like, oh, changes are good. You're going to make a lot of money, and it's going to be great and wonderful. And that's not really the reality. That's kind of a roll of the dice if you're thinking along those terms that changes are going to necessarily be like a boom for your business. There's certain types of changes certainly that do typically are advantageous. Usually those are big changes where the client's adding on a major portion to the work. But small little changes that are scattered about and unexpected, which are more common, quite frankly, can really be detrimental to your business. And most experienced contractors prefer where they have fewer changes, not more changes of that kind, as they are hard to justify the cost to the client, and the client is always suspicious of those costs. So it's a matter of also building trust and having transparency in the work that you're doing. So clients typically don't know the real cost of changes. So they typically do not know the real cost of changes. Some clients might know what a cost is if it's like new, but often a change that's occurring can mean that you've got to rework something that's existing. Sometimes the change is going to have impacts on other parts of the work because it interrupts the flow of the work. So it can be quite difficult to fully appreciate and understand the cost of the changes. Often contractors themselves don't fully comprehend all the impacts that a change is going to have, and as a result they sometimes don't charge adequate funds enough, and they end up losing money on the changes. So really it's hard to get that sort of understanding of the detrimental impacts that a change can have through. So you really, this is where actually BIM models and that we've talked about can be helpful, because you can sort of demonstrate the impact of the change, how it's going to impact the schedule, how it's going to impact the flow of work, etc. That's a very real possibility. Photo documentation can help as well, but really you're in a position where you're trying to sell the cost of this change or the impact of this change. And so that requires educating the owner so that they better understand or appreciate that aspect. And so also they can maybe perhaps limit the amount of changes that they're requesting, or they can bundle them together. We can work collaboratively to bundle them together, which makes it an administrative less of a process, but often that's not possible either. So really you also have to have done your research, done your homework, and be able to justify those costs. And it's a tricky business out there, and there's different views on it. Some contractors will pad the price of the change order because they know they're dealing with a client who's going to try to cut down that cost, and so then you end up with this sort of lack of transparency going on where somebody's asking for a lot more than it's worth. The client is cutting them down on the price, and then if the contractor's lucky, they end up at that price. That's not really being honest, that's not really being transparent, but sometimes the reality of business pushes certain people towards certain ways of operating. I would suggest that the best way is to really have a clear process in place before you start the project, come to a mutual understanding with the client, and have a process of really explaining and justifying your price, because now you're not selling something that you yourself don't even believe in. You're being honest, transparent, and clear with the client. So that is tying to that area. Now, are there unscrupulous clients out there? For sure. So we've got what we talked about earlier in the course. You got givers, you got takers, and you got matchers. And sometimes in a negotiation, if you're taking too soft an approach, you can be taken advantage of. So you have to have some understanding of how that works, but your best avenue is to have the documentation, have the understanding of your costs, believe in those costs, and sell to those costs and negotiate to them. And at the end of the day, you come to a fair and reasonable resolution. So with the client, because there's the short game and there's the long game. If we tick a client off by misrepresenting ourselves, if I'm that client, you know what? I'm not going to want to deal with you next time. So you're not going to be a preferred contractor. I would like to try somebody else the next time, especially in the private sector. There's a lot of choices that way. But if you're selling and you're being reasonable in your approach and you're able to be transparent with that, you're building trust, you're building the relationship with the client, and you know what? I want that next project from that client. I want that client to think I'm their contractor. So yeah, there's different approaches to business from that perspective. That would be the perspective that I would take in those particular areas. But it is a hard sell because it also depends on the type of change. If it's a change that's giving value to the client, then the client sees more value in that, obviously. If it's a change that's like a design error or something that is not really bringing that much value to the client, I don't like those changes if I'm the client. So you got to put yourself in the client's position and look at it from their viewpoint. I'm not going to like those changes because it's not giving me any value. I thought I was only going to spend this much. You're telling me this unforeseen condition is going to cost this much. I don't like that, right? Whereas if I tell you I need this, this, and this, and you're giving me a lot more stuff, I recognize there's a certain cost to it. So it's those items are typically an easier sell, but you still have to be able to justify the cost. And so should a change be priced differently than the original estimate? You know, like if an outlet costs so much dollars to do an outlet, originally when you're pricing the project, shouldn't it cost the same when you're doing a change? Well, I would say no. Because where is it coming in this process? Is it interrupting the flow of work? Do we have any rework involved with this change of outlet? Have things already progressed? Do we still have room in the breaker panel, etc.? And this is also causing an extra administrative layer for us to manage this process and make sure that it actually happens and doesn't get missed. So definitely I'm saying no, it's going to carry a different price because it's going to cost differently. So that's another consideration, but a client would think it should be around the same price because they don't really understand that difference. But it's up to you to be able to demonstrate and prove that it does. If you can't, then they're probably right. So when you think about it, it's things also when we're doing work, you know, owners expect to price changes using unit prices furnished with the base contract. That's why a lot of base contracts, they want certain unit prices with things. But you also have to explain why a unit price might be quite significantly different. So here we got a plumbing fixture might be $600, but it may be $1,800 or more as a change order because maybe it requires a change of location for the rough-in, and this is going to require opening up a wall, and this is going to require bringing in different trades to coordinate, and then we've got to reorder this particular item, and all of these things that all of a sudden make something that's 600 be 1800. It's like my electrical outlet example earlier. It's the same thing, you know. What's involved with this? It could be quite a lot more expensive. And it's going to interrupt the flow of work. Construction's really the only industry that I know of where people make changes very late in the game, and they expect to not have to pay the cost implications. Manufacturers have learned this a long time ago. So typically you don't have that changes going on in a manufacturing process. So when you order something on Amazon, it's not like you're then, after you've ordered it, sending a change order to it, the rowing machine that I've just ordered. By the way, I want a special bracket that will hold my iPad so I can watch my apps while I do the rowing machine. And this is what exactly I want. And then they, okay, sure, no problem. This is what it's going to cost. And no, you just don't have a choice with it. This is what it is. It's already been shipped. You can take it or leave it, you know. Henry Ford's reported to have said you can have a Model T any color you want as long as it's black. And to be honest, Ford, I think, would admit they stayed longer than they should have with the Model T. But in the beginning, the Model T was like fantastic. You know, it took the US by storm. Millions and millions of them sold, and they were pretty much exactly the same. And there wasn't a lot of difference to them. They didn't really change that much. For years, they didn't change until somebody else, which would have been General Motors at the time, started offering models and different model years with different selections. But even that had certain selections within each model. It really had limitations. So in manufacturing, when you buy a car today, you have certain packages that you can typically buy. And you can't even sort things out within the package. You take the package, everything in it, or none of it. And that makes it a lot easier in the manufacturing process. That doesn't interrupt the flow of work. They can set themselves up so they have a continuous flow of work in the manufacturing process. And that's really important for productivity reasons. You don't see somebody running out that somebody had something special that they wanted. I want a sunroof in this particular car, nothing else, and this is the size I want for the sunroof. That doesn't happen. But in construction, it does happen. And those things do cause interference to our ability to be able to still be profitable, because it is interrupting the other flow of work. So we have to be cognizant of how changes affect construction projects in that way. And changes can be very small to large. So it could be something that's fairly insignificant to something that's pretty large. And sometimes these small things can be quite interruptive to the other flow of work. Very large changes, as I said, if it's something adding major value and the client all of a sudden wants to put this other addition onto the other side of the factory and they're adding this to their contract amount, that could be very advantageous, obviously, for a contractor, because it's a big thing, and then they can plan it and they can incorporate it, they can justify the costs. But all the little things is hard. Some of the little things take more administratively than to just do them, in fact. So that's a consideration too. So you have to be kind of cognizant of that. Some things it might be better just to do it and have it done rather than doing the whole change order process if it's so small and so insignificant. But you have to be careful about that with documentation and things, because if there's something wrong and interferes with something else, that could be problematic later on. So it is a normal part of the process, and it's important to have a process set up before you start a project, how changes will be handled and what the process is, and then you follow that process so that way you're tracking the cost of the changes. The client knows the impact of all these changes and how they're adding up to the overall project amount, how it's going to affect time, how it's going to affect cost, how it could impact quality. All of those come into the fold, and we need to have everybody aware of the process and understand the implications of their actions related to that process. There's not always a cost to a change, as I mentioned. There might be just things that you just want to document, that this is just changing something in the way that we're doing. It's a clarification that's changed from the original document. So at least we have it documented. This was agreed upon, and this is why we did it. And it's not really interrupting the flow of work, etc. So it can result in greater or lesser cost. Sometimes changes will make things cost less, and there can be deletions to the contract as well. So that would be a change. Now we're not going to do this. That could have a cost savings involved with it, or credit to the client. So there's a lot of reasons for changes. We'll talk about these. Owner-directed change of scope. They want to add something, want to take something away. Constructive or consequential change. This is where constructive, usually the owner's not agreeing with the cost and it's a claim, so it's not really been sort of settled out. Consequential is kind of like the impact of doing this on other things. And sometimes you should always strive to have the cost of consequential changes in your original change order. The only issue is sometimes you don't necessarily know all the consequential impacts. Very hard, though, after the fact to prove that, but it does come into play fairly often. It's more difficult to show those impacts, and especially after you've agreed to the cost of a change, to try to go back later and get some of that. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. Differing site conditions, job site, so it's something that's different, or some hazardous conditions. There's usually can be provisos and clauses in the contract around, upon discovering a differing site condition, notice of delay, notice of this hazardous condition, and then an approach to dealing with it. But these are all reasons for changes. Code revisions that may be impacting the project. Substitution, maybe you've come up with a different substitution, and they've agreed to it, but that may mean a credit, so that would be a change. So those are some examples for reasons for change. We want to make an adjustment to the contract amount or duration, so there could be some aspects that would be involved with that. If we're maybe an owner wants to move up the finish date. So if you're going to move up the finish date, that means you're going to crash a bunch of activities. Probably there's going to be overtime. That's going to require a change to the contract, because it's also going to impact not only the finish date, but the cost. Liquidated damages clauses. So again, if you're running long, that could have an impact on the contract amount, because you ran 10 days long and there was 25,000 liquidated damages per day, $250,000. That would change the overall contract amount as a result of the liquidated damages involved. Definitely something you don't want to incur, but happens on those types of contracts. Sequence of events. So notice this difference in actual conditions, and so the notification of delay to the architect responds, you get a clarification, and if you determine it's additional work, then a change order is going to be prepared, because the architects looked at it. There's been a clarification that yes, this is not part of the contract. Earlier in the course, we did a case study that kind of worked along those lines. Well, then if that's determined that there's extra cost and a change to the finish date, then there would be a change order prepared. Most contracts will have time as of the essence in them, which really means that time is important, which really means claims can be made along those lines. If especially a client could make a claim at a contractor if they took excessively long to complete the project beyond the finish date. It's not liquidated damages, but it is saying that contract's important, and that would could cause them to still make a claim with regards to that, seeking a credit, of course. So it can be initiated by any party, and it needs to be in writing, the change order process. So you need to make it in writing. There's going to be a format, usually too, as you know, if there's like a notice of delay, or there may be a requirement within the contract within so much period that notice of change should have been provided to the client, or from a subcontractor to the contractor, so that basically it can be dealt with in situ instead of in past tense, like going back months. All of a sudden you're receiving all these changes. That would be problematic, especially if you have no processes in place. So some of the contractor, if the owner and architect agree, you know, what is the process? So if they disagree, revise the proposal, withdraw the proposal. So if you're revising, you can be changing things, what you're requiring. Pursue proposal as submitted. Well, that's some of the options. So if you don't agree, you could always pursue it. And that means you're continuing with the work. The owner doesn't agree that this claim is actually a change, and then you try to seek compensation at the end of the project. Ideally, the owner signs off with the proposal, and then you get it into a change order, and then you don't have any future issues with it. It's sort of done, and it's part of the work going in. If you postpone it, it becomes this change, the next change, the next change, and it becomes this big pile of change. A lot of owners kind of like that because at the end they can leverage what they're going to pay and try to reduce that amount out through negotiation, and that puts them in sort of the driver's seat. So that's kind of a bit of a problem. But at the same time, if you're looking at proposals based on delays, well, the owner might take the stand, well, yeah, but you're going to save time up ahead, so really this shouldn't be a delay claim. So that becomes an issue in those types of cases, right? So change proposal, anything, a claim is just an unresolved change, right? Like it's a claim for a change to be made, but it's unresolved. It has not been substantiated and signed off in a change order. So you need to follow the contract requirements for how this is going to be handled. In some cases, as I said, it might require you to continue with the work, and then the claims get settled later on. But definitely, if you're an astute contractor, you try to get them taken care of as they come up. Construction change directive, sometimes you can't even get it, you have to get into doing the change right away. So you want some acknowledgement that this change directive exists, and so you can go forward with the work. You might not have settled out on the cost because it hasn't been worked out yet, and then in that case it's usually going to be worked out on a cost plus fee. If it's a change that you are able to settle before you do the work, then usually you're going to get some sort of stipulated price or unit price agreement. You can have a cost plus even ahead just to handle it that way, but you wouldn't have settled out on the exact price yet. All right. And this works obviously too for subcontract work, because some things we don't know the full extent of it, or we haven't got time to cost the whole thing out, because if we don't do this, it kind of puts everything else at jeopardy, depending on where it falls on the critical path in the schedule. And so that's where we want to not impede the forward progress of the work, and everybody waits till we settle this change order out. This way it's able to keep things running. I just took this from my textbook, the Understanding Construction Drawings textbook, and it's just sort of a vanilla envelope kind of change order agreement for a small business. But it just gives you the idea. You would log your numbers. You'd have some sort of numbering system for your change orders, and you would describe what the changes are. If you can't fit them here, you would just attach an appendix to it with extra drawings and specifications around what the change involves. And then you would describe and list out what the costs are, and if it's extra, or if it's a credit, or if it's a combination of both. Then also you would show what the previous contract amount is, including all the changes up to that date, and then what this change, how it impacts. And so you would add this and this together, which now shows the new revised contract amount. So clearly the client knows overall what everything is adding up to. You got to be careful if you're just getting changes and the amounts of those signed off on. The client might not be tracking it, and in certain legal courts, if you haven't been demonstrating how this is impacting the overall bottom line of the contract, that can be problematic. And making sure that it gets signed off by both parties, and then you got transparency, you got agreement, you got clarity on these particular areas, that's great. Now you know where you're at. So it's good sort of overview of how those components go together and how a change order agreement gets signed off on, so that there's clarity and you know where you're at. Some projects literally have thousands of changes. Very difficult to manage that kind of amount of change effectively. You really have to have a strong management team in place to track and monitor all of the impacts that those kind of things are having. And projects that, quite frankly, have those kind of changes on a lump sum contract really should not have been a lump sum. They were done wrong.
what kind of lump sum do you have when you have that multitude of changes? So that's where going back to looking at contract models, where contract like that might have been better if it had allocated a little bit more time, had been a cost plus type contract, because if there's that many changes, well, really, what are you getting into with it? Right? So, from an owner's perspective, they're not probably getting the best deal out of it, and the contractor's probably very often not getting the best deal out. And what ends up happening is you have a lot of claims, no settlements, and then it ends up getting a litigation, and it's not good for either party. So the original contract type that you select is important, going back to what we've discussed in this course of different contract types. From that perspective, did the client really take the best, were they given the best advice from the consultants on what type of contract to take? So that's what I wanted to cover in this section of A. In the next section in B, as I said, we'll look at changes in how it affects time, schedules, and income statements. So this is Tom Stephenson signing off for now, wishing you a wonderful day.